Hello, I'm Abby Cadabby, and I'm here to recite a story about Mr. Noisy by Roger Hargreaves. Mr. Noisy was a very, very noisy person indeed. For example, if Mr. Noisy was reading this story to you, he'd be shouting at the top of his voice. And the top of Mr. Noisy's voice is a very loud place indeed. You can hear it 100 miles away. For example, when most people sneeze, you can hear them in the next room. But a tissue! When Mr. Noisy sneezes, you can hear him in the next country. Now this story starts when Mr. Noisy was asleep in bed, in his bedroom, in his house, which is on top of a hill. He was snoring, and as you can well imagine, when Mr. Noisy snores, that is a snore with hearing. It sounds more like a herd of elephants than snore. Then Mr. Noisy's alarm clock went off. Mr. Noisy's alarm clock sounds like no other alarm clock in the world. It sounds more like a fire engine. Mr. Noisy woke up, and so too did all the people who lived in Wobbletown, which is at the bottom of Mr. Noisy's hill. Later that day, Mr. Noisy decided that he had to go shopping. He went out of his house, shutting the door behind him. Bang! The door wobbled. The house wobbled. The whole hill wobbled. Wobbletown wobbled. Even a bird flying high above wobbled. Then Mr. Noisy walked down the hill. Clump, clump, clump. He walked into the baker's shop. Crash with the door as he opened it. Bang with the door as he shut it. "I'd like a loaf of bread," boomed Mr. Noisy to Mrs. Crumb, the baker's wife. Mrs. Crumb trembled and sold him a loaf. You could technically say that I prefer egads better than bread, though actually, egads. Never mind. Then Mr. Noisy walked along the street to the butcher. Clump, clump, clump. He walked into the butcher's shop. Crash with the door as he opened it. Bang with the door as he shut it. "I'd like a piece of meat." Boom, Mr. Noisy to Mr. Bacon the butcher. Mr. Bacon trembled and sold him some meat. Technic speaks. Afterwards, Mrs. Crumb met Mr. Bacon in the street. "We really must do something about Mr. Noisy being so noisy," she said. "Absolutely," replied Mr. Bacon. "But what?" "I know," said Mrs. Crumb, and she whispered in Mr. Bacon's ear. Mr. Bacon smiled a small smile, which grew to a broad grin. "Mrs. Crumb," he says, "I think you have the answer." "You know what his answer is?" "I know what his answer is." The following day, Mr. Noisy again went shopping in Wobbletown. Clump, clump, clump. He went to Miss Crumb's shop. Crashed with the door as he opened it. Bang with this door as he shut it. "I'd like a loaf of bread," he boomed. "I'm sorry, what's that you're saying?" asked Mrs. Crumb, pretending not to hear. "I'd like a loaf of bread," Mr. Noisy shouted. "Sorry, I don't know what you're saying," said Miss Crumb, putting her hand to her ear. "Can you speak up a bit?" "I'd like a loaf of bread," roared Mr. Noisy. "Can't hear you." These cats, Mr. Noisy gave up. Do not talk about Grape Killer Guy. I can't think about this noise. I can't think about this noise. Okay, about the what? I can't even think about it. Oh, top and the monkeys. And those jerks. Yeah. Technically, experience. I don't think about your experience. Mr. Noisy tried Mr. Bacon's shop again. "I'd like a piece of meat," he boomed. Mr. Bacon pretended not to notice him. I'd like a piece of meat, Mr. Noisy shouted. Did you say something? Asked Mr. Bacon. I said I'd like a piece of meat, roared Mr. Noisy. Pardon, said Mr. Bacon. Mr. Noisy came up when I was and hungry. Why can I even think about this? The next day, Mr. Noisy woke up and tries again. Miss Crumb's shop is when he went into. I'd like a loaf of bread, he boomed. What is that? Asked Mrs. Crumb. Mr. Noisy starts shouting at the top of his voice. I'd like a loaf of... And then he stopped. And then he thought. And he said quietly, I'd like a loaf of bread, please, Mrs. Crumb. Mrs. Crumb smiled. Certainly, she said. Okay. Next time, Mr. Noisy tried Mr. Bacon's shop the final time. I'd like a piece of meat, he boomed. Did you say something? Asked Mr. Bacon. Yes, I did, shouted Mr. Noisy at the top of his voice. I said I'd like And then he stopped, and then he thought, and he said quietly, I'd like a piece of meat, please, Mr. Bacon. Mr. Bacon smiled. My pleasure, he says. So carrying his bread and meat, Mr. Noisy went home. Clump, clump, clump. Then he stopped, and then he thought, do you know what he does? He tiptoes. I think it's something Mr. Noisy never tries. I think it's fun. Mr. Noisy arrived at his front door. He puts out his hand, opened the door, and stopped. And then he thought, and do you know what he did? He opened the door quietly. He stepped inside, and then he shut the door gently. Quietly and gently were two things Mr. Noisy never tried. That's fun, too. Do you know something? Then until now, Mr. Noisy's not noisy as he used to be. And do you know something else? People of Wobbleton are delighted, especially Miss Crumb and Mr. Bacon. And do you know something else? What? Mr. Noisy has learned how to be quiet and whisper. You know what? I kind of like this story, and technically, I especially like the part when Mr. Noisy is rather rude, and he needs to learn manners. And you know what? I actually had to say that the story had a happy ending. And technically, I've got a surprise in the ending. I think I got an eraser, and technically, I call this eraser a loaf of bread, and it's for my birthday, so... I can't wait for my birthday that's coming out October 21st. So, the other prize. Oh, that is some skinny popcorn. A skinny popcorn. That's what I used to try when I'm too skinny. Like Mr. Skinny. I think I'm supposed to read this one soon. And technically... Well, I think there's something. Hope it's popcorn. And so I can't wait to open this. What? It's not even popcorn. I think it's Dogman. Yep, I think it's Dogman. Technically, that cartoon character that just stinks. And technically, be sure to subscribe to my channel and see if my channel name is Mr. Noisy and Rolf the Dogs Well 1976. So check out my videos with me in the future. The one I tried when I played checkers. So be sure to subscribe to our channel for more Sesame Street stuff in the future. Sheesh. This commercial has been brought to you by the broken-legged Mr. Tall. And someone needs to fix him. And I think he might have Toto and Greg Allman in the future. And he says, peace out, cologne stinks. And you know what? It stinks.